Well, it sure is good to see everybody here this morning. And again, especially the visitors that we have, we are encouraged by your presence. I do have visitors from back in Oregon. I have visitors from Abilene, Texas this morning. And it's good to see folks, the Rogers family from Abilene. We spent 6 wonderful years together working and laboring in Abilene, and it's good to reconnect with them. They got to reconnect with Jody Thomas also. That's the wonderful thing about Christians is you can go anywhere in the world and at some point you're going to run into somebody that you knew from the past. It's, small world, big family is I think the phrase that we typically use. And even though we throw that phrase around pretty often, I think we throw it around often because it's very true. Now, for the last decade in America, professed Christians have been lamenting our losing effort in what we typically call the culture war. This was recently highlighted by an article called Have Christians Lost the Culture War by Todd Starnes. I'll go ahead and read at least part of the article by way of introduction. The culture war may be lost, and religious liberty might not be that far behind. This is according to a new survey by Lifeway Research, which is the research arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. 70% of senior pastors at Protestant churches say religious liberty is on the decline in the United States. 59% of Christians believe that they are losing the culture war. And again, I'll reiterate that. 70% of pastors at Protestant churches say that religious liberty is on the decline. And 59% of professed Christians believe they're losing the culture war. 11% consider the war to be already lost. The survey results are staggering, indicating grave concerns about the moral direction of the nation from both the pulpit and the pew. 10 years ago, we were talking about who would win the culture war, and now we're talking about how will Christian rights be protected after the culture war has already been lost. Says Ed Stetzer, the president of Lifeway Research. He goes on to say, we've lost our home field advantage. There are going to be some things that are different. Stetzer said it's a big shift, and according to him, it's a shift that he would never have guessed. Now, while I am sympathetic to the feeling of pessimism in the face of massive cultural changes, one of the things that worries me about professed believers and their attitude about the culture war is that they're focusing on all of the wrong battles. I think that we look at the humanistic, the liberal, or the hedonistic pursuits of our culture, and we grind our teeth at the way that America is changing. America isn't what it used to be, we say, and we want to wash our hands from our culture because it's sliding so far down a sinful path we don't know how we're possibly ever going to bring it back. We weep because our voice and our vote are drowned out by people who don't share our worldview. We fret over the ever-shrinking scope of religious freedoms in our country, or at least religious freedoms as we perceive them to be. But in all of this pessimism about losing the culture war, I think that we've forgotten that the culture war was already lost a long time ago. I think that we have forgotten that that is a war that we were never meant to win, never designed to win, or intended to win by God. We have to remember something important about our culture, and it is in 1 John 5 and verse 19. Consider in 1 John 5 and verse 19. We know that we are of God. We also know that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. I like both statements in that verse because on the one hand we have a confidence of who we are, exactly who we are. We're also supposed to have some degree of honesty about the way the world works. Now, there's an idealism that we can have about our country. We would like to believe that this country is as good as we wish it would be, that it could someday be as good as we thought it used to be. But there's also a reality that we have to acknowledge that this is the same way with all cultures in human history. And even a very elementary study of human history shows that we are no different than any other society before us. You look at every great kingdom, every great empire, every great nation that has existed in human history, and all of them have gone through essentially the same process that we have. What may have started with the best of intentions, what may have started with some grand ideals, with some morality and righteousness behind it, what country is built on a righteous foundation always, invariably, inevitably slides into unrighteousness. And I think that we're kidding ourselves if we don't think the same thing is going to happen to our own country. Now, it's not that we should wring our hands or wash our hands, It's not that we should just wash our hands of it and say, well, I guess that's the way it's going to be. We just have to understand that when the war is lost, which it will be lost, that we really haven't lost anything at all. And again, like John says, we know that we are of God. And even though the whole world lies in the power of the evil one, we still know who we are. Even if Satan was to rule the whole world, we still know who we are. And we've not lost anything. We've not been defeated in anything. You take away government from the Christian. Take away pop culture from the Christian. Take away schools from the Christian. And you know what? We haven't lost anything. We haven't lost anything. Satan, according to 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 4, or John 12 and verse 31, Satan is the ruler of this world. He's the god of this world, Paul says in 2 Corinthians. And we will always lose the war if we believe that it is a worldly one. And that's okay. It's okay to lose the culture war, because God never intended for us to win it in the first place. John 18, verse 36. Jesus himself said that his kingdom is not of this world. If his kingdom were of this world, then why wouldn't we pick up guns and swords and clubs and fight our way into power, political domination? If his kingdom were of this world, yeah, sure, let's get guns and let's kill every sinner out there. Sure. If his kingdom were of this world, Jesus very clearly says, my people would be responding to the world's problems in a very different way. They would be rising up and they would defend me if my kingdom were of this world. But as it is, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. So we put down the guns, we put down the clubs, we put down the swords. Jesus heals the ear of the man whose ear was cut off the night he was betrayed. He heals that man. He says, just put the swords away. Remember what Paul wrote to the Corinthians, that the war that we wage is not a physical one, it is not a carnal one, and we don't fight with those kinds of weapons. But the weapons of our warfare are spiritual. Not for tearing down political movements, but for tearing down spiritual fortresses. So I suppose that you can say that if America was nothing more than a smoking, smoldering pile of moral wreckage, we still will have not lost anything. The promise of religious freedom, for example, doesn't come from the Constitution. Did you know that we had religious freedom long before the Constitution was ever penned? Did you know that the right to assemble as a body of saints doesn't come from the Bill of Rights? We had the right to assemble as Christ's people long before the Bill of Rights ever came around. Remember that a human government can neither grant nor revoke the privileges and responsibilities that God gives to His people. Those are things that only God can do. Which leads to an interesting thought. We are a Christian nation persecuted by a Christian nation. You ever hear that term thrown around, Christian nation? That wasn't America supposed to be a Christian nation? Wasn't it designed to be a Christian nation? Isn't there God in all of our founding documents? Weren't our founding fathers at the very least moral deists? So aren't we supposed to be a Christian nation? Well, I would offer to you the idea, the very sense, the very concept of America being a Christian nation is foreign to the Bible and should be anathema to the Christian, because there is but one Christian nation. Who's the Christian nation? How about God's kingdom? How about the church? There is only one Christian nation, and it is God's kingdom, as it exists not just on North America, but all around the world, where people have proclaimed the name of Jesus Christ and have obeyed Him with all their hearts. That is the Christian nation. So we have an interesting situation now in America, don't we? Because we, God's people, are His nation. We are His kingdom, living in a proclaimed or supposed Christian nation, being persecuted to tears now. Should it really surprise us, though? Should it really surprise us that we're in this situation and that our country is in many ways opposed to the Christian ideal? Remember, like I said earlier, governments and human authorities always tend to drift toward unrighteousness. So it's inevitable and natural and backed up by centuries of historical precedent that this is going to happen. And even with all this knowledge, we still find ourselves so surprised that we could be persecuted the way that we are. Yet Peter says in 1 Peter 4 and verse 12, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you." Remember the context. First century Christians weren't talking about having their vote marginalized. First century Christians were not talking about having to bake a cake for a gay couple's wedding. First century Christians were talking about being put to death in the Colosseum, being eaten alive by lions, having their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods taken away from them by an uncivil, cruel, and hateful culture. And we complain about our culture, don't we? And yet here's Peter within the context of that culture saying, why are you people so surprised at what's going on? Why are you so surprised at the fiery ordeal that's among you? Maybe we're so surprised by it because it just hasn't happened to us in the same way that it did to those early Christians. Persecution feels like a strange thing to us. And I think especially for Christians who were raised in maybe what our imaginations think is the golden age of American moralism, the 1950s. Maybe people who were raised in the 1950s have this sense then that we've lost so much, that we're defeated, that we're beaten down now. I always try to remember that until I'm dying in a Colosseum, I really don't have a whole lot to complain about compared to these wonderful examples that we have in the first century. Go to Hebrews chapter 11, like we studied last week. When you read in Hebrews chapter 11 some of these examples of those who by faith did all of these things, he begins in Hebrews 11 and verse 35, saying, "Women received back their dead by resurrection, but others were tortured, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated." And I love what verse 38 says, "Men of whom the world was not worthy." This world was not worthy of people like that. If we lose America, we have not lost anything, because America is not worthy of us. It is not worthy of us. If we lose our culture, if we lose our pop culture, if we lose our government, if we lose our institutions, we've not lost anything, because none of this is worthy of us anyway. And that's not me being arrogant. That's not me patting myself on the back. That's not Christian pride. That's pride in God. God has taken sinful people and molded them into a nation of saints walking the earth. God has taken those people who were not worthy of mercy and granted them mercy so that we can be priests in this world, so that our examples can shine to our children and our children's children, so that they too can look back on us as we look back on those in Hebrews 11 and say, men of whom the world was not worthy. Men of whom the world was not worthy. Perhaps a lot of our discouragement comes from intertwining our country's morality with our own identity. That we think that if America's morals fail, then we, God's people, have failed somehow. That if America crumbles around us, then the church must be crumbling around us as well. Remember, though, that the church and the nation are two very separate entities. They each serve a distinct divine purpose. God designed government. God allows government. God even props up government for a specific purpose. You can read about that purpose in Romans 13, for example. Peter even talks about that in his first epistle as well. That government does serve a purpose. But government is also temporary. Government does not have the lifespan of the church. Governments come and go. Human authorities come and go. The church does not, though. God's kingdom is for eternity, because it is built upon a foundation of Jesus Christ himself, who is the chief cornerstone. And so as countries crumble around us, the kingdom of God as a building, as a structure, is actually being built up and growing stronger day by day, with souls added to it, with faith growing stronger also. As Christ-like people, we are told to live as our Savior lived, to participate in his suffering without question. I always remember what Jesus said of his own suffering and how his people would follow after his example. You remember in Matthew 11, verse 19, Jesus was called a drunkard. You remember in Matthew 26, verse 65, he was called a blasphemer. You remember in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 25 that he was called a devil. He says in response to all of those things, it is enough for the disciples that he become as his teacher, and the slave to become as his master. If they called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more the members of his household? So let the world hate you. You can't stop it. You can't change it. The world does hate you. I know you don't want it to. We don't want the world to hate our kids. We want to fit in. We want to have a place in society. We want to have a voice at the table. I know we don't want to lose jobs. We don't want to lose friends. We don't want people to think that we're the weird people on the end of the cul-de-sac. But you know what? The world hates you. Learn to be okay with it. Learn to be okay with the world hating you. Because Jesus said, don't be surprised by it. If they treated me a certain way, they're going to treat you a certain way as well. Let's go to Revelation chapter 12. I want to notice one thing here, the imagery in Revelation 12 of the way that the world hates God's remnant so very, very much, and that just bothers Satan. It frustrates Satan. And we won't spend any time talking about the imagery itself, because we are going to be looking at Revelation later on this year in great detail. So we'll have time to talk about what each symbol means in this story. But for the time being, let's just understand that Revelation 12 is talking about God's remnant, God's people. Now, however you want to interpret that, we can talk about that in our classes later this year. But let's just understand that the woman in question here in Revelation 12 is God's remnant. It is his people in this world. Begin in verse 10 of Revelation 12. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night. Who's the accuser? You remember from the book of Job? Who was the accuser in Job? It was none other than the devil himself. And the devil stands before God accusing us the same way he accuses Job. Verse 11, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb. Not because of their own righteousness, but because of the blood of the Lamb. And because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even unto death. This is the Hebrews 11 people. This is the Hebrews 11 people here. They desired a better resurrection. So when somebody came around and said, I can kill you because of your confession of faith, or you can rescind that confession and I'll let you live. They said, I'd rather have a better resurrection than that. I don't love my life. I don't need this life because it's not my life. I'm going to heaven. They did not love their lives, even unto death. Now in verse 12, Satan gets frustrated. For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in heaven. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. You know, Satan's mad at us. He doesn't particularly like us. And if 1 John 5 is true, if we're to take that literally, that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one, that Satan has infiltrated all human institutions to a degree, government, universities, public schools, pop culture, awards shows. If we're to take that literally, that Satan has infiltrated and has some degree of control over the affairs and activities of this world, then don't be surprised when governments and universities and school systems and pop culture and award shows are opposed to the Christian worldview. He has great wrath on his heart. He hates us. And he's going to wield things in this world for the purpose of defeating us if he can, but he's not able to. And you see in the coming verses here that even when the serpent, even when Satan uses great power at his disposal, a rush of water to try and drown the woman, the remnant, God's people, the earth itself saves them. The woman is delivered. Look in verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. You're at war with Satan right now. You're at war with a foe who hates you vehemently. And he's very passionately fighting for his own cause. Don't be surprised by it. Many heroes like Noah and Moses and even Jesus, they all lost their culture war too. You think it was easy for Noah to spend almost 100 years building an ark and preaching to that generation? You think it was easy for him to close the doors on a world of people who did not listen to him? To take only his children with him and their wives? You think it was easy for him to lose the culture war, to take 8 people on an ark that could have carried so much more? Do you think it was easy for Moses to lose the culture war? Was it easy or comfortable or pleasant for Moses to watch the 10 plagues fall on Egypt? Do you think Moses enjoyed it when livestock were destroyed, when rivers were choked with blood, when the firstborn were killed in the dead of night? Do you think Moses enjoyed losing the culture war? Do you think Jesus enjoyed it? In John chapter 6, as we'll read here in a moment, in John chapter 6, when most of his followers left him because of what he said about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. All of these other characters lost the culture war as well. We'll talk about Elijah in a few minutes, because Elijah got very discouraged in 1 Kings 19, believing that he had ultimately and supremely lost the culture war in his day. Now, even before our time, voices in the world had been ridiculing the church and organized religion, saying that religion was on the decline. In spite of that, C.S. Lewis argued that we should not be discouraged when people talk about the decline of religion. The question that we must ask is whether or not it is true Christianity that's declining. In one quote I have here, C.S. Lewis reminded his contemporaries in Europe during his lifetime that what was declining in his day was not Christianity, but merely a vague theism where church-going was merely a matter of loyalty, good manners, and respectability. In other words, a decline in the numbers at times may only mean one thing: that what one is seeing is the separating of the true believers from the half-hearted. Or as he says in God in the Dock, in his own words, once no one goes to church except to seek Christ, then the number of actual believers can actually be discovered. I've always liked that quote. Maybe religion is in decline. Maybe our country's morals are falling down the toilet. Maybe that's the case. But I suppose one benefit to that is that we get to see who the true believers are. We get to see who actually believes in Jesus in spite of what's going on around them. We get to see who will believe in Jesus if it does cost a job or a friendship or a family member. We get to see who will actually believe in Jesus when all of culture has set itself against them, when government has set itself against them. We'll actually get to find out who's along for a free ride and who is actually interested in serving Christ and going to heaven. That is one of the benefits of religion in decline. Now, like we already alluded to in John chapter 6, beginning in verse 66, after he had taught the people about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which he clearly says was a spiritual thing, not a physical thing. It says in John 6, as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. Jesus said, therefore, to the 12, you do not want to go away also, do you? When the masses were leaving, he challenged his 12 disciples. Everybody else is leaving. Everybody else is rejecting. Everybody else believes this is a mess. That what I'm saying is false. Are you going to leave also? Peter answered to him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And we have believed and come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Now, if Jesus is anything like me, and I think that in some ways we share a lot of things, it can be very discouraging when you see the majority of people running away. But then you have that small victory. The one person who does accept the gospel. The one person who does change. The one person who does show true love for Christ. And in that moment, you forget about the 1,000 failures that you had yesterday. In that moment, you forget that there is a great many people in this world who will cry out on the day of judgment, Lord, Lord, did we not? And he'll say, I did not know you. In that moment, you'll say, sure, we didn't save a lot of people. But you know, we got that one person. We helped that one person. The funny thing about helping one person at a time is that if you keep at it, those one-person situations tend to add up. And before long, you realize that the gospel actually does work. It really does change people. Let's look at 1 Peter 1, verses 6 and 7. Because trials are there to prove what our faith is really made of, and we should be grateful for this. In 1 Peter 1, verses 6 and 7, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. That the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. If you ever want to know what the proof of your faith is, if you ever want to know what it's really made of, you have got to put that faith through the fire. You will never know the proof of your faith until it has passed through the furnace. And in this we greatly rejoice. We don't rejoice that people mock us. We don't rejoice that we're not welcome at the discussion with the rest of the intellectuals of the world as they try to solve the problems. You know, we rejoice that we're given an opportunity to prove what kind of people we are. Remember that there is value in even a small demographic. If only a few people accept the gospel, if only a few people remain faithful to Christ, God is still pleased with that. We mentioned earlier in 1 Kings 19, verses 10 and 14, how Elijah basically climbs into a cave, hides from the world's problems, and gives up and says, well, now I'm done. I should just die now because I'm going to fail anyway. I'm no better than the prophets who came before me, and they were all killed. He says, Lord, they have killed the prophets, they have torn down thine altars, and I alone am left, and they are now seeking my life. And essentially, what God does is through an angel, he kicks Elijah in the side and says, get up, eat a meal, and get back to work. You're not as alone as you think you are. Quoting this story in Romans chapter 11, verse 2, Elijah says, Lord, they've killed thy prophets, they've torn down thine altars. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. And his response to that, God says, is, there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Consider a couple practical applications as we get near the end of our lesson here. God doesn't judge the value of these 7,000 based on the mere number. He's not saying there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, and that's a lot of people. He's not saying that there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, and that's not very much. He's simply stating a fact that there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, do we think that God considers a church of 20 less valuable or less victorious than a church of 200? Does God consider numbers when it comes to seeing how people are victorious? Are we victorious because we baptize a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen or 100 people a year? Or are we victorious because we remain steadfast? Numbers don't always reflect victory. After all, some victories by the numbers are merely Pyrrhic victories. A Pyrrhic victory being something that costs so much to win that you've actually lost the war. Numbers don't mean anything to God. He sees 7,000 who've not bowed the knee to Baal, and he doesn't care that it's 7,000. He just cares that they didn't bow the knee to Baal. God didn't say, yeah, Elijah, I get your discouragement. I know sometimes I just want to lay my head on a rock and fall asleep too. I get it, Elijah. Times are rough, and I only have 7,000. God never said, I only have 7,000 who didn't bow the knee to Baal. He wasn't discouraged by such a small number. He was proud of them. And I suspect that if God had said, I have 7 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, he would have been just as impressed with the 7 who didn't bow as the 7,000 who did not bow. Not only that, he never saw Elijah himself as a failure. He didn't kick Elijah and say, I should find a new prophet. You're not really doing a very good job. He didn't blame Elijah for that failure because it wasn't a failure. Clearly, Elijah had done something, or else 7,000 people would not have bowed the knee to Baal. His teaching, his example, his prophecy must have had some impact on them. And finally, this small number here, this very small number relative to the total population of Israel, remember, 7,000 would not have been a whole lot of people. Really would not have been a whole lot of people. But this small number served only to emphasize the overall righteousness of the nation, unrighteousness of the nation as a whole, in stark contrast to the idolatry of the rest of the nation. These 7,000 who did not practice idolatry would have shined even brighter. And maybe that's why I'm not too discouraged by losing the culture war. When we say we're losing the culture war and that this country is falling down the toilet bit by bit, maybe what we're losing is fake Christianity. Maybe what we're losing is materialistic Christianity. Maybe what we're losing is clout when it comes to voting or political voting bloc. But you know what? The way I see it, and maybe I'm just an eternal optimist here, but the way I see it, the darker this world gets, the more opportunity I have to shine brightly. Understand, I'm not saying that we're talking about grading on a curve here, that the darker the world gets, the less effort you have to put in to shine brightly compared to it. No, I'm simply saying that we have more opportunity. The darker this world gets, the brighter the Christian can shine in the midst of a wicked and perverse generation. Our uniqueness in Christianity, our uniqueness in our faith, acts as a black backdrop to the rest of the world. It exposes those who are fake. It exposes sin for what it really is. I remember in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 19, Paul makes a reference here, for there must be no divisions among you, so that those who are approved may be evident among you. Are you evident as a faithful follower of Christ? Is it obvious who you are? Is it obvious where your priorities are? Is it obvious to the people around you, both believers and unbelievers, that you are a saint walking the face of a very temporary earth? The outcome of this culture war has already been decided. Like we said in 1 John 5 and verse 19, the whole world lies in the power of evil, and this is his world. It's fine. He can have America. I don't want it. I don't want the United States of America. I don't want the Academy Awards. I don't want the Rose Bowl parade. I don't care about that stuff. I want heaven. Satan can win the culture war, but we win the spiritual war. And just like the culture war's outcome has already been decided, the spiritual war's outcome has already been decided as well. When you read in Revelation 19 about the victorious Jesus riding on a white horse with an army behind him, clothed in white linen, that is not the image of somebody who's worried about how this thing's going to turn out. Jesus rides that victorious white horse with a crown on his head as if the war is already over. Satan fell from heaven like lightning. He's failed. He's lost. He's defeated. And all we have on this world is the last flailing attempts at bringing as many of us with him to hell as he can. Remember, don't get too attached to this world. The United States and everything in it, your house, your flag, our capital, every monument that is on the face of this earth, it's going to be destroyed with intense heat on the last day. It's going to be gone. I love America. I think this is the greatest country in the world. I don't ever make any bones about that. I'd rather live in the United States of America than anywhere else. And for those who might be watching on the internet internationally, I'm not saying that as an insult to any other country. I'm saying it because I love this country. But I love it for what it is. Temporary. Fleeting. Fallible. And at times very, very broken. And that's okay. I can lose the culture war, but I have won the victory. We are victors in defeat, my friends. Now, if you're not a Christian here this morning, you really ought to be. It's time to leave the Christian nation that's falling apart so that you can become a part of the real Christian nation. A building, a dwelling place that God is building up every day, whose foundation is Jesus Christ, whose cornerstone is that man as well. You can become a part of that building, a part of God's kingdom, by believing in Jesus Christ with all your heart, by confessing his name, by being baptized into the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, by living your life faithfully for a God who loves you so much that he gave his only begotten Son. Friends, it's time to be part of the kingdom. Whatever needs you might have, please come forward as we stand and sing.